Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Whitsett, the Executive Director of Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University. On behalf of our team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. At Morrison Institute, one of the ways we serve Arizona is through the Arizona Governance and Policy Academy, which is made possible with generous support from Arizona Public Service. This academy, which is designed to strengthen policy leadership by providing accessible, nonpartisan learning opportunities for policymakers, community leaders, and practitioners, offers a collaborative space where evidence-based ideas and practical tools come together to address Arizona's most pressing issues. Today's webinar on Sentinel event reviews is an excellent example of how the Academy works. By applying this approach to public safety, we can re-examine critical incidents in ways that lead to more collaborative, transparent, and constructive outcomes, strengthening both policy and community trust. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by three experts who bring deep experience and insight. First, we'll be hearing from Michael Scott, a clinical professor and director of the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing at ASU's Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. Then we'll hear from Art Hinshaw, the Associate Dean for Experiential Learning and Director for the Lodestar Center for Dispute Resolution in the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. And then we'll hear from Lee Rankin, Assistant Chief of Police for the Mesa Police Department. They'll share their perspectives on how Sentinel event reviews work, lessons we can learn from past cases, and how this process might advance innovation in Arizona. So thank you again for being here. And now I will turn it over to Mike to get us started.
Thank you, Andrea. In all occupations, despite best intentions and best efforts, errors can and do occur. But in some occupations, those errors can be catastrophic, even fatal, such as in the case of train derailments, airplane crashes, spaceship explosions, and even in the medical system, where people can die under medical care. But errors and catastrophes, although they're inevitable, they are systematically preventable. And in most of these occupations that I've mentioned, we've seen significant reductions over time in catastrophic outcomes. For example, annual railroad-related fatalities in the United States have declined significantly, even just in the past several decades. Likewise, over a long period of time since aviation began, the number of fatalities due to airplane crashes have declined significantly. But what goes down doesn't necessarily stay down. There can be upticks, as we've seen in the airline industry in the last couple of years, some slight increase in the number of fatalities, requiring constant attention to why this might be happening. In all of these fields, systems have been developed to investigate catastrophes and to learn how to prevent future similar catastrophes. Perhaps the best known is in the mass transportation field, where the National Transportation Safety Board comes out to investigate all airplane crashes and train derailments, bus crashes, and so forth. The medical field itself also has a structured system for investigating why patients might die while under medical care. They conduct what are called morbidity and mortality reviews. So too in the criminal justice field, errors can and do occur, and they can lead to catastrophic outcomes as well. Police-involved fatalities, wrongful arrests, botched criminal investigations, sometimes ultimately leading to loss of public trust in the police. So too in the corrections field and in prosecution, errors can occur that lead to innocent people being convicted and incarcerated, and once in prisons and jails, Some people die, something that should never occur. So each of these segments of the criminal justice system, policing, courts, prosecution, corrections, have different typical types of errors that can occur. In policing, it could be inaccurate detentions of the wrong suspects, arrests of the wrong suspects, botched investigations, laboratory errors, excessive use of force, denial of people's constitutional rights. In the courts, it could be denial of speedy trial, wrongful convictions, and in corrections, of course, in custody deaths. Now, in the criminal justice system, when these catastrophic errors occur, typically there will be a number of types of investigations to review them. There will be a criminal investigation to determine whether the criminal justice actor, the police officer, the prosecutor, the judge, corrections officer, did anything criminal to lead to the catastrophic outcome. There'll be administrative investigations and reviews to determine whether that person followed or broke an organizational policy or a procedure, and discipline could be meted out accordingly. In some cases, private civil lawsuits will be filed to determine liability and to award damages. Sometimes the government can launch civil rights investigations and see if constitutional, systemic, or individual case constitutional rights have been violated. And lastly, investigative journalists often weigh in and conduct their own investigations, reporting their findings to the public. What we're here to talk about today is yet a new and a different type of review of these catastrophic outcomes, a review that we commonly call a Sentinel event review. While all of those other types of reviews, the criminal investigations, administrative, civil rights, journalistic, are all necessary, we would argue that they're not sufficient. A Sentinel event review is distinct. We define it as a confidential, non-disciplinary process with the aim of identifying and addressing all of the contributing causes of the undesired outcomes. There are some core principles that apply to this concept of a Sentinel event review. Among them, that the reviewers, the investigators and the reviewers have sufficient independence from the organization in which the error occurred. That those investigators and reviewers are not systematically biased in any way in terms of that investigation, either in favor of the organization and the employee or against them. That there be a degree of transparency in both the investigation, the findings, and the remedies. That there be real accountability, that somebody is actually responsible for conducting the investigations, reviewing them, issuing findings, and then ultimately doing something about them. It's also critical that the investigators be competent. They may seem self-evident, but there's different types of competence that are required to investigate different types of errors. You need expert investigators. And lastly, they have to be credible. They have to be credible not only to the public, but also to the officials and the employees working in the field being investigated. These Sentinel event reviews, they tend to be broader than criminal or administrative reviews. They're deeper. They're asking a lot more questions that are not relevant in a criminal investigation. They focus mostly on causation rather than on blame. And of course, the ultimate goal is prevention rather than just remediating past harm. A couple of years ago, I, along with a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, were invited and requested by the Tucson Police Department to assist in a Sentinel event review of 2 separate in-custody deaths that involved Tucson police officers. Both of these were in custody deaths that occurred to young Latino men who were highly intoxicated on drugs at the time, but their deaths were unexpected and led to catastrophic perceptions of the Tucson Police Department, such that even the chief tendered his resignation because the public perception was so critical of the police. To his credit, or to their credit, the city did not accept his resignation, and this allowed the Sentinel event review to occur. In that review, we reviewed all video and document evidence about the incidents, identifying anything and everything that we could find that we felt might have contributed to these unwanted deaths. I'll turn this over now to my colleague Art Hinshaw from the law school to describe some more current work that we're doing. Art?
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for the great overview of the Sentinel event review process. The one thing that I really want to emphasize is that it is a systemic-based review, which is something that is really important just to keep in mind as we keep these conversations going forward. Several years ago, I was talking with people in my field, dispute resolution, just about things we were working on. And I had some colleagues at other schools who said that there were some good opportunities working with police departments, and it was good work. And we were talking about sort of what made it good and those sorts of things. And we were talking about the social contract between the police and communities. And they thought that that's a good place where there's sometimes some friction, and how do we deal with that, and how do we resolve and manage conflict in a constructive way. And I brought this to one of my colleagues here in the law school who studied criminal law, and she said, hey, there's this thing, Sentinel Event Reviews, introduced me to Mike Scott, and we talked about could we do one? And we found this grant proposal, or this grant opportunity, through the American Arbitration Association's International Center for Dispute Resolution, their foundation. And what they were enticed by was the fact that we were looking at community and police relations and that social contract. And so we put in a proposal, and we were able to get one of the grants that they awarded, and we were able to work on. Well, they gave us a grant to work on 4 different situations here in Arizona. We've completed 2, we've all but completed a 3rd, and we're in the process of trying to identify a 4th one. So we thought that, excuse me, what I would do is talk a little bit about each of these incidents. Some of them received a lot of news attention, like the Tucson incident that Mike worked on. And anyway, maybe you'll recognize them. And I should also say that under the grant, we were able to continue Mike's work with the Quattrone Center at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. So the first one that we did was in Tempe. And this was a situation where a police officer misidentified a suspect in a robbery at a hotel. And instead of, well, basically, the description that came across the police radio was that the suspect was white and ran through the kitchen and out a door. The police officer who came basically picked a hotel employee who was black, held him at gunpoint, and made him kneel down on the hot concrete in over 110 degree weather. It got some news coverage at the time. And so we met with the Tempe police and went through all kinds of protocol that they have and how we could work on making sure that this kind of event did not happen again. The next one was with the city of Sedona. And this was a situation where we had a man who was having a mental breakdown, and he was out in a quasi-rural part of the area. And he happened to have a sword, a machete, that he had on him, and he was chanting and doing all kinds of things. And the people who lived there were very disturbed. And so the police came, and they were asking him to do all kinds of things, and he just wasn't doing them. And then he raised his sword or machete and just started approaching the police, and they were following police protocol. and they ended up shooting and killing this gentleman. Now, the reason that we were brought in for this one was not the actual shooting of the individual himself. It was more of the impact that this had on the officers who were engaged in this situation. That's what originated the call, I should say, to us. And so we went through the situation, and we came up with a bunch of factors that we thought should make a difference in these kinds of situations going forward. It was a very, very sad situation, as you might expect. The third one also involved a murder, and this one, I remember watching the news reports on it when it happened, and it was in the city of Surprise. And in Surprise, what happened was a neighborhood 4th of July party. One of the people who came to the party, everybody's sitting at these tables. There's maybe 100 people at the party in the house and in the backyard. Everything seems to be fine, and then he pulls out a gun and just starts shooting people. And so he's one of the neighbors. He lived a couple houses down, and so other people at the party overwhelmed him and shot him and this made news for a number of reasons. But the reason that we were invited was that there were problems at the crime scene after the event. There were way too many people there for the number of officers who were involved. And so how was it that in these terrible, horrific situations would the city of Surprise interact with crowds who were there, people who were victims? I mean, everybody who was there was a crime witness. And so they all had to be interviewed. And then, of course, once it got out that this has happened, people were rushing there to check on their loved ones. And so it ended up that people were standing out in a park until day broke the next morning, waiting to be interviewed. And there were children who were a part of the witnesses and all this kind of stuff. And then the interactions with the police afterwards were not necessarily ideal. So in each of these situations, we prepared a long report. We looked at video. We read all kinds of documentation, everything that you could get your hands on as far as background. And we came up with specific reports that gave numerous suggestions of things we could do or things that the police departments could do from a systematic level to keep this from happening again going forward. And with that, I leave it to my colleague Lee Rankin to go into detail into one of the SERs that was not done as a part of this project, but was done with the police department in Mesa, and so that he could give us some more detail along those lines. Lee, take it away.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Art, for that introduction. So in 2022, the Mesa Police Department experienced 17 officer-involved shootings. For us, that was concerning in that on average, the city of Mesa experiences anywhere between 6 and 8 officer-involved shootings. I think the epiphany had occurred when early on in the year, dealing with a family member who's we were engaged in an OIS, and the family member said, Mesa has had more officer-involved shootings this year than the LAPD. My initial response internally was that can't be the case, but I immediately looked it up, and in fact, at that point in time of the year, we did have more officer-involved shootings than the city of LA, which was, again, concerning to us. But as we have done in the past, we have collaborated with ASU because we believe that in order to be accountable and transparent, to partner with a third party, again, in this case, ASU, really allowed us to take a deeper dive into a systemic approach at looking at what was driving the 17 officer-involved shootings within the city. The first thing we did is we engaged our crime analysts. So we pulled all the data that was relevant to the 17 officer-involved shootings. That included the report, the body camera, 911, and radio traffic. It included any subsequent reports as a result of each of those cases. We looked at demographics, not only of our officer, but also of the suspect. We looked at a variety of data sets. Once we compiled those data sets, we reached out to Arizona State University and said, look, we're interested in a Sentinel event review. We understand that typically it's one event, but in this case, we're asking for a thorough review of all 17. That way we could look at what potentially is the systematic issue that we're being presented with. So again, we engaged Arizona State University, and and that was in January of 2023. As we did, we put together a multifaceted teams that included subject matter experts, but they included non-tenured patrol officers, senior patrol officers, detectives. We wanted to get a multidisciplinary team together that really had different perspectives on what some of the factors may have been in these officer-involved shootings. They were presented the same data that we presented to Arizona State University. Again, we were transparent. We provided all the reports, body camera. We provided the 911 and radio traffic unredacted. We had an NDA with them because of our partnerships in the past. We knew that they would adhere to that NDA. So we released everything because we wanted all the data to be there for them to evaluate. Ultimately, we also brought in 18 community members who live, work, or play in the city of Mesa who were involved in really diving deep into what the data was. We asked them to do a lot of homework, and we provided, again, all that information to them up front so that they also had the ability to look at it and make a decision as to what was driving these officer-involved shootings. So when Arizona State University was done in March, after looking at these 17 cases, they came up with 10 different considerations or recommendations. We broke those down into the 4 themes that you see there, but those considerations consist of communications tactics, patients, risk safety, vehicles, and also emergency medical care. So each of those considerations were assigned to a team. Each team had anywhere between 2 and 3 that they had to go through, and they went through those systematically. We started in May, and we met every month, sometimes twice a month, through December in order to be able to get through the volumes of data that was presented. Also, we had those opportunities after each one of these iterations with the community teams as well as the multidisciplinary team to present to the exec staff and then also get feedback from them. So just as an example, I do want to cover one of the considerations just to really kind of outline what those iterations look like. So I'm going to talk about ASU's recommendation on patrol rifles as a means to really convey how the other 9 looked. So again, the themes, and then what we received from Arizona State University. They were concerned that we were deploying our patrol rifles outside the scope of our policy, that the rifles were being utilized as primary weapons and not as cover weapons, and that they were being used closer in range than they were intended for. So instead of using as cover weapons, they were being used as entry weapons in some cases, but not all. But we wanted to look at the data as well. So again, as our analysts pulled together the data sets, these are some of the data sets that we did consider. So upper right, you see officer experience and the type of firearm used. So we see that the rifle deployments predominantly were used by officers who are 6+ years on the job. When you look at the type of calls, those 17 calls, we see that which is highlighted in red represents the initial information that we had from dispatch that the suspect was armed. And even in those cases where it's listed in blue, that was information that they were not armed, but later found to be armed. And then in the 2 gray ones, those were pre-planned operations with our violent offender unit. So we had a lot of data ahead of time in terms of the violence potential of the suspects that we were encountering. Additional data that we looked at, we see that a vast majority of officer-involved shootings and rifle deployments did occur on patrol. So well over 67% of our 17 were patrol related, where a smaller percentage was SWAT and even smaller gang related. Additional data sets, you'll see that we had deployed 230 rifles out in the field, and 94% of those officers had 3+ years on the department. And then ultimately, you look at the distance in which the rifle was deployed. So you see one incident where it was greater than 91 feet. The rest were relatively closer in distance when the use of the patrol rifle was deployed. We did find that a vast majority, 58%, it did occur in open areas, so we labeled that as street. A smaller percentage did occur within more confined spaces, such as an apartment complex and residence. So that was an opportunity to look at the policy directive. So in the end, as we did with all 10 recommendations, we looked at 10 to 15 other agencies for best practices. We know that there's agencies that do it a little bit differently out there, and we understand that we could also learn and grow from what other agencies provide. So we strengthen the patrol rifle program based on the recommendations. So you see, we had switched patrol rifle operators from just off probation to have 3 years on. We also gave supervisor more responsibility in terms of patrol deployment of those rifles. And you'll see we provided them with much more direct bullet points as to the checklist that we want officers to consider before deploying the rifle, that the rifle shouldn't be their primary weapon, as ASU had noted in their Sentinel event review. And then we told them, as you could see there, not to be used for small clearing spaces. And then also there's a supervisory responsibility to understand how many of those rifles are being deployed on any one given call. So what we did with the rifle program is the exact same thing we did with the other recommendations. And I will say, out of 2 others that resulted in significant changes, it was shooting at, from, or at a moving vehicle. 10 of the 17 of our OIS's involved vehicles. The policy rewrite based on ASU's findings are significant and have resulted in a significant decrease in those type of officer-involved shootings. The other causal factor that we noted was the use of less lethal munitions, such as the beanbag. What we found is that when beanbags are deployed against an object and not against an individual, that they tend to escalate, not de-escalate a situation. So again, in those cases, we rewrote policy to reduce the number of incidences where we might be escalating a certain event. And with that, I will turn this back over to Dr. Scott.
Thank you, Lee. So far, whether it's here at ASU or at the University of Pennsylvania in the Quattrone Center, we are conducting these Sentinel event reviews on an ad hoc basis. And by that, I mean, in all of these cases here in Arizona and the ones conducted by the University of Pennsylvania, we were invited in by police chiefs to review particular incidents that they wanted to understand better. And we welcome that. And we think that in the relatively early stages of this, developing this concept of Sentinel event reviews, that we have established that we have proved that it can be done and it can be effective. What's left to decide now, I think, as a matter of public policy, is whether this experimental ad hoc review system that we currently have ought to be transformed into something more systemic. Whether we ought to create a mandatory Sentinel event review system that would parallel what we see in some of the other occupations that I mentioned, including airline and train safety. It's an open question, to a policy question, as to whether these reviews ought to be discretionary or mandatory. My own view is that I think in order for us to make substantial progress in learning about what causes various kinds of catastrophic outcomes, we ought to be moving toward a systemic Sentinel event review system. And if that proposition were accepted, the next question would be, at what level should that occur? The airline industry and the train industry, the NTSB doesn't just investigate airplane crashes in Montana. They investigate them anywhere in the United States. In fact, they investigate quite a few even internationally upon request of other countries. But they investigate every one that occurs that meets their criteria that occur in the United States. And likewise with these medical morbidity and mortality reviews, these are required throughout the medical profession. They're really not an optional thing. So that would be one issue to decide, is should this be a national system? Could it be just each state deciding to create a system? It could be just a county-wide system, or it could be a municipality decides it's going to have all of its incidents reviewed systemically. I think ideally my own sense is that statewide systems make the most sense to me. But if that were adopted, of course, there would be a number of issues to be considered. What should be addressed in these reports? Should there be a standardized report? Who ought to automatically receive a copy of the report once it is completed? Who ought to have access to the report, anywhere from journalists to the average citizen? And several other issues that if a legislature, for example, decided they were wanted to create such a system, there need to be some legislative authorization with specific provisions. We actually drafted a statute that was considered by the Wisconsin legislature, but has not yet been adopted. You need to create an administrative structure comparable to the National Transportation Safety Board that would determine who is going to actually investigate these and who would review the findings. We'd probably have to create a new administrative entity, have to make sure that the existing governmental entity had established the requisite authority and accountability. You'd need funding to pay for people. You'd have to have personnel with the right qualifications and expertise. You have to decide whether these people would be working full-time or on call. Critically, you'd have to decide what kinds of incidents would be subject to mandatory review, what type might be subject to discretionary review. You have to think about the investigative methods, a number of legal issues about access to evidence, the timing of investigations, confidentiality, subpoena authority, public access to the reports, and so forth. And of course, there's some entities that would be logical if we created such a system in the state of Arizona, for example, want to involve most likely the Arizona Peace Officer Standards and Training, district attorneys, organizations, judicial organizations, police executives of all the agencies that might be involved, and the local governments that could be involved. And of course, most critically, is determining who is going to be responsible for reviewing these recommendations and taking action? What accountability would there be? It's well and good to investigate these incidents, to develop a set of recommendations, but given that the ultimate goal is to substantially reduce the risk of similar bad outcomes in the future, that necessitates that somebody be responsible for actually implementing the recommendations. And who's responsible is going to vary depending on each specific recommendation. Many of them might be within the purview of a police executive, a chief, or a sheriff to implement. But we have found in our reviews that oftentimes the contributing factors lie outside the control of the police. There may be changes that need to be made at a governmental level, maybe in an entirely different occupation, in the field of medicine, in the field of aviation, in the field of gun manufacturing, and so forth. So you'd really have to have some strong oversight and to create some strong accountability to make sure that these reports don't just end up collecting dust on a shelf. With that, we would invite any questions or comments from our audience. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, Lee and Art as well. I feel like that was very interesting and informative, and it certainly does raise some questions. I want to point out for any of our guests who are joining us today that if they'd like to dig a little deeper, you can find additional case studies and resources on Sentinel Event Reviews at the Quattrone Center website, and we'll be dropping a link to that into the chat so you can access it. Please use the Q&A box that is the function you'll have in your Zoom window to submit questions for our panelists. And it looks like we're all on camera now. I'm going to give people a moment if they want to drop in questions. Looks like one to get us started, and you've touched on this a little bit, but what makes the Sentinel event review process different from other ways of reviewing critical incidents? And maybe you could comment on some of the pros and cons, and I'll open that up to any of the three of you.
Well, I'll take the first shot at it, having written somewhat on this. I think the main difference is the Sentinel event reviews ask a different set of questions than do criminal investigations and police administrative investigations. Criminal investigations have a limited scope. They're basically to determine, was a crime committed, and if so, who committed it. Administrative investigations also are likewise usually limited to asking, was a policy violated, and if so, who violated it and why? What we're asking here is really less about who made a mistake than what are all of the different factors that could have contributed to this unwanted outcome. And that is a much broader inquiry. It's the why did this happen, not just who did it, what did they do, when did it happen, where did it happen, but really getting at why did it happen and how could we prevent it from happening again. Art, Lee?
Sure, I think I'd like to add a couple of thoughts in terms of why a Sentinel event review really spoke to us when I spoke with you, Dr. Scott. To your point, it does provide a broader look into a given event. So for instance, I know when we had talked about the Tempe incident, and if I could bring that up since it was mentioned during the interview, that some of the factors involved had nothing to do with the police. Some of the factors had to do with city providing different, in the case I'm talking about was the gentleman that drowned in the Tempe Town Lake. And part of the Sentinel event review there was flotation devices, other type of life-saving equipment that really fell outside the scope of the police. So when we had that conversation, it really kind of spoke to me in that we understand that there's other contributing factors to any one incident that really have to be considered beyond just simply the criminal investigation.
And if I could just sort of piggyback on that a little bit when it came to the city of Tempe. There was also on that first Sentinel event review we did with the misidentified suspect, there was like a bank robbery at the exact same time. So part of our discussion was like, how do police decide how many people go here and how many people go there and things along those lines? So it becomes quite broad. For those reasons, I think it makes it much more acceptable, I think is the right term. But like Lee said, he reached out. It makes the police like realize that we're trying to be helpful. We're not trying to really point fingers. We're not saying the police are bad or anything. We're just trying to make sure these things don't happen again.
Yeah, and one additional point I would make is that I think in all of the reviews we've done, it's not just the reality, the catastrophic outcome, but the perception of it that was important. Certainly in the Tucson incident, the perception of the police and how they handled it was almost more, at least as important as what exactly happened, is how is it handled. We saw that in the surprise incident. We definitely saw it. It was at the heart of the Tempe incident that we reviewed. Those matters of public perception are, for the most part, irrelevant to criminal investigations and not terribly relevant even to administrative investigations, but they can be central to a Sentinel event review.
Thanks for those answers. We have another audience question that's been submitted. This one is, how do you see the role of civilian oversight intersecting with the Sentinel event review process?
Lee, I don't know if you have civilian oversight boards in Mesa. If you do, maybe you want to take a shot at this one.
Sure, I'm more than happy to respond. So we do not have citizen oversight boards, but what we do, for instance, as I discussed with this Sentinel event review, we reach out to the community. In this case, in reviewing the 17 officer-involved shootings, we had 18 members of our community who are actively engaged in reviewing the 17 OISs. They provided feedback. Their feedback was considered not only by the team, but it was considered by the training staff, the policy, and those ideas were incorporated as part of the overall team. So again, not oversight, but more in partnership, if you will, in terms of coming up with a solution that adds not only transparency, that adds accountability, but ultimately allows us to police in the way our community wants us to police.
And as the one civilian on our interview team or our presentation team, by the way, for those of you who didn't know, before moving to academia, Michael Scott was chief of police in various cities across the country. The thing that I saw here in organizing these is what Lee just talked about, is the getting people involved in these reviews. It takes time. We have to identify people who have the time, who have the desire, who can be productive. And Mike, I believe that your experience in Tucson, you even had some people who were, really tough customers when it came to the police. And we're not doing kid gloves here, but we're really trying to look at it in depth so we can solve problems.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, and I'll admit I hadn't given it much serious thought before. But you're right that where we're creating these civilian oversight boards, it might be more productive to have them more engaged in these systemic kinds of reviews than it is to have them reviewing every single complaint one at a time. For example, if the city of Phoenix has created a citizen accountability board, and it could make sense if the city of Phoenix said, we want to review all of our critical incidents with a Sentinel event review. There could very well be a good role for that existing body to play a part in that. Now, when we drafted the legislation for the state of Wisconsin, we contemplated creating a separate kind of civilian oversight board, really a Sentinel event review board with that specific mandate.
And if I could just get back on this for a second. The idea of civilian oversight, this gets back to the social contract between communities and police entities. And when Mike was saying, sometimes it's just the reaction, it's not the actual event itself, it's how people how the event was dealt with. That's where that contract comes into play. And one of the things that has been most heartening to me is the responsiveness of the agencies, the policing agencies that we've been involved with. They've just been fantastic.
Yeah, and just one more point to that, something we saw in the Tucson incident is that there were, as I think Art had suggested, there were some very critical, strong critics of the Tucson police, not just over this one incident, but people who had been very unhappy with the relationship with the police department for a long time, involved in this, actually in the review of this incident, or these two incidents. And what was notable is at the end of it, both the police officials and the community participants, board members, said they really had a much deeper appreciation of the other perspective than they did before. These community critics said we really had no deep understanding of what the police have to deal with in these kinds of incidents. Now we do. And to their credit, even the police union officials participating in this said, we really did not fully appreciate how traumatic these deaths were to our community. That helped us understand why they were so angry. So there's a lot of introspection and learning that can occur in these when they're done right.
Thank you. There is a lot of nuance, and those were good points. We have another good question that was just submitted. This one says, I'm wondering about the admissibility of SCR results in corresponding pending civil or criminal proceedings. Do you think the results would be barred as subsequent remedial measures, or will there be a need for changes to evidentiary rules?
May I take this one?
You may
Start on it, since I'm in the College of Law. All right, so this is a really great question. And so this is one of the things that Mike was talking about when he was talking about what are some of the policy issues if we were to engage in this kind of a system statewide or anything along those lines. And just to be clear, at this point, we've been engaged in situations where either the civil proceedings have been completed, they've been resolved, there's no other claims to litigate, or the statute of limitations has run on these particular claims. So, Ms. Schultz, your question is something that we have been thinking about while we've been doing this on an ad hoc basis, for sure, for the reasons you point out. Why does she point them out? Because I mean, these could be used as evidence against the municipalities, right? Against the police, and saying like, oh, they didn't meet these standards, those standards, the other standards. So one of the questions that this particular inquiry begs is, when is the timing of these review incidents? Number one. Number two, should there be evidentiary exclusion for these reports when it comes to civil claims, all kinds of things along those lines, which are important policy questions. At this point, we've been pretty good with dealing with it afterwards, but I'm not ready to make a recommendation one way or the other. Mike, maybe you've thought about this in some of your other work.
Yeah, in the legislation that we drafted for the state of Wisconsin, and myself and some of my former law school colleagues at the University of Wisconsin Law School worked with the legislators to draft this legislation. We incorporated what we call a safe harbor provision, which effectively precludes the use of any information derived from the Sentinel event review in civil litigation. And we got that idea because we knew that in the medical field, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had created a medical review center for reviewing under medical care deaths in that state. And they included a safe harbor provision there. And we do think that it is, especially whereas Art said statutes of limitations have not lapsed and there is still pending litigation, these safe harbor provisions would be critical to get the full cooperation of the involved criminal justice officials.
Great. I can see we have a very astute audience because we're getting some excellent questions. So I'm going to move us to the next one. This says, I see the Sentinel event reviews brings in community representatives along with different subject matter experts. To what extent have folks who plan and implement SCRs for local policing involved community members whose loved ones have been killed by police officers to be part of the SCR process? And what do you see as the primary challenges or opportunities associated with intentionally inviting civilians who've been personally traumatized by OAS into this process?
We have to give a first try on that one. I think this has to be handled cautiously. You know, as I said, one of the core principles needs to be an absence of bias. Bias is going to be very evident if one has a personal stake in the critical incident. So I think bringing family members and loved ones into this process, at least in terms of the investigation and or the review, is not quite appropriate. But I will say, for example, in the Tucson incident, one of the other core principles I've talked about is competence. Well, you might ask, well, what is a lay person? What competence do they have to review these things? And I think what we discovered in Tucson is their competence is not necessarily in police procedure or weapons or tactics, but it is they have expertise in community perception and community and the knowledge of how this has impacted the community. And as we pointed out in a number of these reviews we did, that was a central part of what was considered the bad outcome. It was how the public perceived the police department. And so it's a different kind of expertise that I think lay people can potentially bring to this process. But the other kinds of expertise would be, medical professionals who are not criminal justice experts. We had emergency room doctors and nurses and communications officials helping us, depending on the nature of the incident.
I would like to add to Dr. Scott's comments. Having on many occasions have dealt with family members whose loved ones have been involved in a critical incident. The need to have that impartiality, that unbiased look at the aggregate really makes it difficult for the department as well as the family to bring them in and engage them in kind of a critical review, and given that they have such a personal stake in one given incident. And I don't say one given incident as to diminish it, but when we're looking at systemic related issues, the discussion is always broader. And my experience is that it would be very difficult to bring someone who has been so significantly impacted and incorporate them into a broader discussion.
My sense is that I'm really worried about re-traumatization of these individuals. For instance, in the Sedona review, we watched videos and we watched this person getting shot and killed. And do the loved ones want to see that? I don't think they do. I think that would be really, really problematic. And so, again, the question is, I can understand why we would want to interview family members and things along those lines. But there's a lot of things that we look at, and surprise, we looked at crime scenes, and it was a mass, I don't know that it officially was a mass shooting, but a lot of people there was a lot of blood and a lot of stuff. And that's not for the faint-hearted. And we don't know anybody who's involved in it. It impacts us in and of ourselves. And so I can only imagine the potential harms that it would place on people who are already victims.
Thanks. Those are thoughtful answers to a very sensitive question. I think we'll go to one more question before we wrap up. Can any of you comment on what you see as the biggest challenges or opportunities to creating a routine statewide Sentinel review system?
It's as best I could tell, it's simply political will. And which takes some courage. I'm not trivializing that. It takes some political courage. The first step we took in this, when I was still in Wisconsin, and the step that we took to enact the first law in the nation that mandated that police-involved shootings be investigated by an outside agency, not by the officer's agency itself. That took political courage on the part of, we brought both Democratic and Republican legislators together to deliberate this very carefully and thoroughly. Brought a lot of stakeholders in to contemplate this and to draft the legislation appropriately. And that took a lot of effort to get union officials, police chiefs, sheriffs, insurance companies to all agree on this. But it can be done. So it's really political will, and I'd love to see certainly Arizona why we couldn't be a leader in the nation in doing something like this.
And I think that maybe 5 years ago, this discussion would have been a little bit more difficult. But my experience, having worked with Dr. Scott and worked with the IACP on the Investigations and Operations Committee, I have presented this concept of Sentinel event reviews to other agencies, and have found really a broader level of acceptance and even willingness to engage in this process. I don't know that would have been true 5+ years ago, but I think that what we're seeing now is a willingness to be much more progressive in the way that we share information, we open up, like I said, 10 years ago, there's no way I could have shared body-worn camera, 911, and radio traffic. But the acceptability, it continues to grow. So I think this is something that we keep pushing, and something ultimately that will find wider acceptance.
Anyone have any final thoughts they wanted to share?
If I may, I just saw there was one last comment in the comments, and that was about, hey, don't the police have biases too? And the answer is, of course they do, right? And so that's one of the issues that we have to deal with when we're putting these events together, and we've had to deal with it in different kinds of ways. And so usually what we have is we have outside experts who, aren't involved with the policing entity itself. We have other like subject matter experts who deal with just basically what kind of training do police officers get for firearms, things along those lines. And of course, the individuals involved who are outside of the police bring their own expertise in. I think one of the things that helps us on the bias front, I mean, I guess if you had the attitude that all police are going to protect themselves because we protect the blue, I think I think you have to get past that because my experience in doing this is that the police really want to make sure that these things don't happen again because they're really hard to deal with, and they cause a lot of fallout, a lot of political fallout, and a lot of trauma for the officers themselves. So yes, there certainly could be some bias there. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the proposal that Mike put together with his team when he was up in Wisconsin was to have it as an independent agency in and of its own, so that there would be less opportunity for bias out there.
Thank you, Art. I'm glad you noticed that final question that got submitted. So before we conclude, I'd like to take a moment to thank each of our panelists once more, Michael Scott, Art Hinshaw, and Lee Rankin, for your time and expertise today. And I also want to offer a special note of gratitude to Lee, who is transitioning after more than 30 years with the Mesa Police Department to take up a new public safety role in California. Lee, thank you for your outstanding public service and ongoing collaboration with Morrison Institute and ASU. We are grateful for the opportunity to have worked alongside you, and we wish you every success in this next chapter. Finally, on behalf of Morrison Institute and our Arizona Governance and Policy Academy, thanks to all of our attendees for joining us and for your thoughtful engagement. Those really were some fantastic questions that were submitted. We hope you'll continue to connect with us for future programs. You can learn more about Morrison Institute and all of the research that we offer, as well as the Arizona Governance and Policy Academy, by visiting our website, which is www.morrisoninstitute.asu.edu. And with that, I'm pleased to conclude today's webinar. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.